So welcome back, everybody, to another webinar organized by Princeton for everyone worldwide. We're very happy to have Leah Boustan with us. Hi, Leah. Leah will talk about her new book, Streets of Gold, America's Untold Story of Immigrant Success. So very curious to hear her new insights about America's success of the immigrants. And before I give the floor to Leah, I would like to make a few opening remarks, even though I have to admit I'm not really an expert on this topic. So I will just raise some questions, more or less. And so I want to start out with saying, you know, what does Einstein, Gödel, von Neumann, and Morgenstern have together? Essentially, they're all German immigrants from during the Nazis in Germany. They all came to Princeton and essentially had huge impact on the development of the academic community here in Princeton. And of course, I forgot many important names. But more generally, there's a famous paper by Petra Moser and others who show that the Jewish immigrants from Nazi Germany increased US patents by 31% in their field subsequently. So it had a huge impact on the sciences in the US. And similarly, the Soviet immigrants had impacts and so forth. And the question is, you know, what are the benefits from immigration for various countries, in particular in the United States? And are these benefits fairly distributed across society? And who is benefiting from that? Or is it very concentrated in a sense? So that's the first thing. And of course, Leah will talk about different generations of immigrants. The first generation, second generation. So the only expertise I have is that I'm a first generation immigrant. But there are many more who have, you know, made big impacts. So Sergey Brin from Google, Elon Musk, Tesla, SpaceX, and Stefan Bassel from Moderna, just to name a few. And there's even a prize. The Carnegie Foundation has a prize for immigrants. And the question is, if they're successful, is because of the selection, is because there are huge restrictions. You have to be highly educated in order to immigrate. Or is it because you work very hard because you don't have your family safety net in the country? So you might be worried you might be kicked out, or you might be working hard in order to cover essentially safety on your own. And then as a second generation, for the second generation, I guess the bigger impact might be education. You know, what education you get. Is it just superb education, you're well integrated and superb education? And of course, there are also famous examples of second generation, like Ugo Sahin in Germany, who actually founded BioNTech, and like Moderna and BioNTech, essentially with Pfizer together, have helped us out the COVID crisis. In terms of empirical identification, perhaps it's useful to look at adopted children who are successful adopted children. I don't know what the answer is for that. It might be a nice control group. And Stephen Jobs comes to mind, who was adopted out of Syria, and then, of course, was, as everybody knows, foundational for Apple. And the question is, you know, which countries are better in integrating and can draw a bigger advantage if you look across the countries? And there's, of course, always a tension. In some countries, it's argued immigration is just a burden on the welfare state. And other countries have not such a welfare state, and hence it's less of a burden. So there might be some hesitancy. In other countries, it's the case that they're too successful and hence damage or hurt the existing population. So there's always this argument. So we're trying to learn more about that. So let me go to the poll questions. You answered the questions. So when did the US welcome the largest number of immigrants relative to its population size? Was it in 1880? That's what 58% of the people thought. Or in 1920, that's what 32% of the people thought in the audience. Or was it more recently, just before COVID, and that's only 10% thought that? The second question is, which children of immigrants moved up the economic ladder the fastest? Were the Italians in Ellis Island's generation in the 1940s? Or was it El Salvadorians and the Nicaraguans today? Or is it roughly the same pace among both of them? And the answers were 46%. So in 1920s and 1940s was much easier compared to today, the 16%, or roughly the same as 38%. So the majority said the good old days were better. Few said, you know, now it's better. And then is, you know, 38%, it's roughly the same as it was previously. Then the third question was about, I am worried that immigrant success may come at the expense of the US born in various ways, perhaps The US doesn't have such a huge welfare state, so it's less of a burden on the welfare state, but there might be some other expense, taking some jobs away and so forth. Yes thought only 4%, no thought 84%, so it's a huge majority. And then they are not sure is about 12%. So most people think it's actually a plus to have immigrants, and it helps the others. It's not really at the expense of that. The fourth question, I'm worried that partisan gridlock will prevent any meaningful reform of immigration. Then I think the answers here, I would say, less conclusive on that. So with these answers, let me pass on the floor to Leah. She will tell us what we really should have answered, and what her new book will tell us much more details how and why immigrants are so successful, first, second, third generations, and we're looking forward to it. Thanks again, Leah, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Markus. I'm really honored to be here to share some of the findings from my new book. And so everyone can see the slides. Yeah, okay, good. So Markus actually set me up really well to tell you about what's new in this book, because he highlighted a number of immigrant scientists, both in the past, so scientists that were fleeing from the Nazi regime in the 30s, as well as science, finance, and tech people today who are CEOs and innovators. And so we certainly hear these anecdotes, these stories that really make it to the front page of the paper, either positively or negatively, that immigrants are among our CEOs and scientists, or that they tend to be criminal or bring drugs and crime. And these are really based on anecdotes and not based on the full population of data. And so what we bring in Streets of Gold, and why we call it America's Untold Story of Immigrant Success, is that we're really bringing the first big data sets for the past and the present on immigrant families to try to get a sense of what the typical immigrant looks like, both overall and then country by country, so that we're not going to be overweighting the successes that are at the very top that might be quite salient, or some of the failures at the very bottom. We organize our thinking around a number of immigration myths that we think are quite prevalent in the national conversation about immigration policy. And some of these are myths that we ourselves held before we started looking into the data. So we're definitely not coming here to say we're experts and we know better, but I think that we share a national story about immigration, that somehow immigrants were very good during the Ellis Island generation, that they were scrappy, they worked hard, they pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, and they moved from rags to riches. And that immigrants today, we might, have more concerns. They come from a more diverse set of countries. Maybe they're not doing as well. And so we start with this myth of the streets of gold, the idea that anyone can come to America and strike it rich here. And ask, how true is that? Was it really true in the past that Ellis Island immigrants from European countries arriving in the US, say around 1900, could move up in one generation? And is the pace of upward mobility really slower today? And so one way of thinking about this question is this quotation that's painted on the wall of the Ellis Island Museum, if any of you have been there. And it was said by an unknown Italian immigrant, so we don't have an attribution for the quote. But the quote allegedly says, "I came to America because I heard the streets were paved with gold. And when I got here, I found out three things. First, the streets weren't paved with gold. Second, they weren't paved at all. And third, I was expected to pave them." So we really want to go back and use data on millions of immigrant families like this unknown immigrant here to reassess these common myths about the American dream. And we want to do this as much as possible over 2 centuries, so comparing the past to today. And I think more than ever, evidence on this topic is really sorely needed because of our current political climate. If you go back just as recently as 2002, you can see that members of both political parties, both Democrats and Republicans, were equally concerned about immigration. So this is one particular question that's been asked by Gallup. You can find very similar patterns with other questions This one is, are you worried about illegal immigration? And around a third of members of both parties said yes. And there's been growing partisan divide because of movement in both parties. So Republicans are increasingly likely to say they're worried about immigration, and here particularly illegal immigration, and Democrats are increasingly less likely to say so. And so we really lack a set of shared facts and a shared framework. And that's where we hope that Streets of Gold will contribute to the national conversation. And we're concerned, and I think some of you are as well, that immigration policy is stuck in a holding pattern. That basically a Democratic president will come in and they will use executive action to make certain sets of changes. A Republican president will then come in and they'll use executive action to undo those changes or to make new ones. But it's been harder for us to address really the central questions, like should we expand the slots for legal entry or should we cut them? How should we address the 11 million immigrants who are undocumented and live in the country? And it seems hard to come to consensus for bipartisan reform. And so increasingly, immigration policy is being made by the executive branch and not by Congress. So, what we're trying to add to the story is what we call the first big data on immigrant families. And there's a fair amount of good data for today, which we're going to use and borrow from. And what we're really adding is the ability to follow immigrants and follow the US born for comparison through historical records. And so we started by digging through websites like ancestry.com. And I don't know if any of you have used Ancestry to look up your own relatives. I've done that. And in fact, this PDF is from my own great grandfather living in Chicago in 1920. His name was Hyman, and he has his wife here and his 8 children living at home. The 7th child was my grandfather, Matthew. And so this is the kind of process that you can do on your own, and you can watch as your grandparents or great grandparents move to the US. 10 years later, you can follow them up in the census to see how they're doing, follow them to the end of their career, and then follow their children. But we needed to be able to do this for not just 1 or 2 families, but for as many possible families as we could. So we have a research partnership with Ancestry.com to have the underlying data. That would be if you typed in your grandparent's name, the underlying database would pull an observation for you, and we have access to the underlying data. And then we've been developing linking algorithms to follow a person over time. And that's why I say that we're able to follow a much more representative sample of the population than just looking at the real success stories or the real failures. We get a sense from this historical data about a whole variety of things in immigrant lives. When did immigrants leave school? How well do they speak English? The occupations that they held. By the time we get to 1940 census, we can look at income as well and not just occupation. We can see who they married, what names they give to their children, where their children moved, and how they might have fared when they left home. And so I'd like to organize my discussion today around 4 of these myths. And in the book, there are more of them, but I think these are some of the most important ones. So I'll lay them out here and then I'll talk through them with some of the data. So is it really true that we have an unprecedented flood of immigration today? Now, I think almost everyone on the call knows, actually. I'm quite impressed that you all know that we had more immigrants, slightly more in 1880 or 1920 than we do today, although we're catching up just in the recent data to that period. Most Americans do not know that, so that is impressive, and it's a sign of the audience who's on the call. Is it really true that the Ellis Island generation rose up quickly, that they experienced rags to riches, and that today's immigrants are slower and not as successful? That would be a conversation about the first generation. So about Markus, we'll learn about him. And then we want to know about the children. So if immigrants today are coming from a set of poorer sending countries, will their own children become stuck in a permanent underclass? And then finally, given that we will talk about some immigrant successes, particularly for the children of immigrants, does this success come at the expense of the US born in the labor market? In the book, we also talk about other things like crime and so on that might be on the minds of voters. So I can dive in now with myth number one, but I do see that Marcus unmuted himself. So I don't know, Marcus, did you have something you wanted to add?
Well, I will have a question about number 3, but I will wait for now.
Okay, great. Okay, so let me dive in then with number one to say quite simply that we're not in the midst of some sort of unprecedented flood of immigration or an immigration crisis. Um, in terms of absolute numbers, of course, because we have more people than ever before, we do also have more immigrants than ever before. We have 45 million people in the US who were born in another country. And that makes up around 1 in 7 Americans, and so around 14% of the population. And that's certainly a lot. And so there's been work that Stephanie Stancheva and Alberto Alessino did asking Americans, but also people in other receiving countries, whether they have a good sense of how many immigrants are in their country. And Americans wildly overestimate the share of the population that's foreign born. But in that case, the public is really getting it wrong. In fact, immigrants accounted for a similar share of the population a century ago and for 50 years. So this Ellis Island period lasted for 2 generations. And so basically check back with us in 50 years. And if so, if we're maintaining the 14% share of the population, then we would finally reach the level of inflow that was experienced during the Ellis Island period. In between, of course, you'd notice this very obvious dip in the share of the population that's foreign born, starting in 1920 and going forward to 1970. And this is policy driven. This was when the US closed its border to European immigrants, and particularly targeting Southern and Eastern European immigrants starting in 1921. Before the US reopened the border in a constrained way in 1965. So we think that getting the story right on immigration is incredibly important for economic growth, for inequality, for the labor market, for human capital, because at any moment we really might find ourselves in a new political reality where border closure might be on the table again. I mean, we've gone through it before and we might go through it again.
So Leah, there's a
Yeah.
question by Ehud Ron who would like to know, the numbers are these legal immigrants or they're all legal and illegal immigrants?
So these are the best possible numbers on all immigrants. These are
Okay.
numbers that come from the census. The census does not ask a question about visa status. And so in theory, the census is supposed to capture everyone who's living here. And some of these folks who are foreign born may not even technically be immigrants. They could be our students who are technically not immigrants, but they are temporary residents. So it should include temporary residents, permanent immigrants, naturalized citizens, and undocumented immigrants. Of course, there's some question about whether the census undercounts certain populations. But the way that we get our measure of how many undocumented immigrants we have is comparing a census benchmark that's supposed to include everyone to inflows that are actually legally counted, and then looking at the discrepancy between the two and saying, well, those folks must have come in without authorization. So it's really the best we can do, though, recognizing that perhaps the number is, a percentage point higher today because of some under enumeration.
Do you also have some numbers how long it takes on average to become a US citizen? Is it longer these days than it was in the early 1900s?
It is longer these days. So the process in the past took 5 years. After 2 years, you could declare your intention. So you filed what was called your first papers, and then you would come back 3 years later and you would become a citizen. So usually that's around as long as it takes now to get a green card if you're lucky. So the process is longer. And that does get to what I wanted to mention next, which is while the past and the present here are very similar in terms of number of immigrants relative to the population, there are, of course, many important differences between the past and present. So there's really no reason to a priori think that we would find similar patterns of upward mobility. And so this diagram here is something that we include in the book to represent an exercise that I do with my students here at Princeton, Ron does with his students at Stanford, where we basically just ask the people in the class, when did your family come to the US? And each one of these dots represents a family of one of our students. And we always replicate what we call this immigration U, where there's a lot of families during the age of mass migration from Europe, a lot of families recently, and very little in between. And just using this diagram to document some of the differences, the immigrants that came to the US 100 years ago were almost uniformly from Europe. Those who were not from Europe came from Canada. So immigrants in the past were coming from a set of sending countries that were more similar to the US born in terms of underlying culture and background. Today, immigrants are coming from all over the world. 75% are from Asia or Latin America. So that's a very important difference, and that might lead us to think that we would expect differences in the outcomes. Also, as we were just talking about, today there are limited slots for legal entry. And so a number of immigrants, a quarter of immigrants today, either overstayed their visa or entered at a land border without declaring themselves as an immigrant, and so they came in without authorization. In the past, provided that you were European, there were very few restrictions. You didn't even need a visa or a passport for travel. And you did not certainly need an employer or a family member to sponsor you. And finally, and this difference is a little more subtle, while in the past immigrants were coming from relatively developed countries, Europe, whilst there was a spectrum and some European countries were quite rich and others were poorer, they were still within the top 30 countries in the world. Yet, if you look at who from Europe came, the Statue of Liberty really is correct that it was the poor, tired, huddled masses. It was the less landed, less likely to have assets, lower occupational status families that sent kids to the US during that period. Today, we are certainly pulling immigrants from poorer countries. In fact, 9 out of our 10 top sending countries are ranked between 90th and 150th countries in the world in terms of level of GDP per capita. So substantially down the distribution in terms of the country background, but we're pulling the more educated or wealthier members from those poorer countries almost universally. So very different sets of immigrants today as in the past. And yet what I'm going to walk through for the rest of today is how very similar the patterns of upward mobility have been. Okay, so I'm
how many of the immigrants today come through universities? Do you have any numbers? Is that a very small number, I guess, or that they'll come to a US university, get an advanced degree, and then stay in the US?
Well, I don't know that particular number, but the share of immigrants who have higher than a BA degree. So that doesn't mean they necessarily came to the US to study. They may have studied abroad and then come in, for example, with an H-1B visa, is much higher than the US population. I don't have the numbers on the tips of my fingertips, but if it's something like 20% of immigrants, but only 15% of the US born or something like that. So immigrants are disproportionately likely to be in that high skilled group. And that group does represent a sizable share of immigrants. So if it's 15 to 20%, that's a large number of the immigrant population. But of course, it's not everyone because immigrants are quite bimodal in their skill distribution. They're either represented at the very top or they're represented at the very bottom, with a group that we would traditionally call high school dropouts in the data. But really, in many cases, even people who didn't start high school, that they had 8th grade as their highest year of schooling, given the country and the opportunities that were open to them.
So there are 2 questions, if I may.
Yeah.
So Brett DeLong would like to know, in what way is an immigrant from Nigeria more similar to the Americans than an immigrant from Kishinev or Trondheim 130 years ago? So in what sense? And the second question is also, are African immigrants not so significant because you focused very much on Asia and Latin America? So it's about, what are the similarity between somebody from Nigeria and from coming in the olden days from somewhere in Asia or Europe versus?
Well, really, I mean, maybe not that different. I think that typically we think if we only look at the first line here, Europe versus Asia and Latin America, oh, well, the immigrants of the past must be, very overlapping with the US born in terms of culture and values and skill and background and that sort of thing. Whereas today we're pulling from a much wider set of countries, so there must be much more diversity, heterogeneity, and difference. Not necessarily, given that we are pulling from the above the median, if not sort of the top 20% of education levels from these sending countries. So Nigerians are actually one of the two countries of origin with the highest levels of education among immigrants to the US. Nigerians and Indians sort of go back and forth as to be whether they're the highest or the second highest, with around 80% of Nigerian immigrants holding a BA or above, compared to around 35% of the American population. So the Nigerian case and other African countries is very interesting. And when we get to talking about the children of immigrants, I can highlight the Nigerian data point, which we do have enough data to say something about.
Thanks.
So let me move to the second myth here, which is a myth about the past. And I think that this myth often gets used in political discourse. The idea that the Ellis Island generation rose up quickly and that immigrants today are not as successful. So we think of it as rags to riches, sort of a nostalgic view that you could arrive penniless, but quickly you could move up the ladder. And what we find in the data is that this myth is wrong in two different ways. First of all, many immigrants in the past did not arrive in rags. And secondly, those that did not move up to riches. So what I'm showing you here is a set of earnings calculations relative to the native born. So if you're earning the same amount as the native born, you would be at the zero line. And this is controlling only for age. And then otherwise, we're looking at a whole set of different European sending countries for people who arrived in around 1900. And what we see in the black bars is how these immigrants are faring when they first arrived. And what we see in the white bars is after we followed them for around 30 years. And there's a set of sending countries where even upon first arrival, these immigrants were earning more than the average US born worker, with a difference in earnings of around $2,000 in today's dollars on a basis of around $20,000 for the average earnings of the time. So a 10% earnings premium for immigrants that are coming from England, from Wales, from Scotland, from France. There's a small premium from Germany. So talking about mostly the Western European sending countries that were either neck and neck with the US in terms of GDP per capita or were above the US. And right around that 1890, 1900 point is when the US overtook the UK. So this would be as if many of our immigrants today were coming from Germany and Japan and Canada, and were earning more than the US born because they were arriving with a lot of skill. Sorry, go ahead, Markus.
It just strikes me that if you compare Germany and Austria, they are very similar countries in many respects, even the language is the same. But if you look at the 30 plus years, Austria is so much better than Germany. Is there any explanation for that, or have you looked into that?
I don't have a good explanation for it. And, the one group that people do usually ask about is Finland, because the Finnish have this very strange pattern where they're basically not moving up in earnings while everyone else is. And so they sort of start to fall behind. And basically, we've been thinking about this as, well, it's 16 data points, so it's really hard to start to explain the differences. But it's a good question. And remember, if you report Austria as your birthplace, it's really Austro-Hungarian Empire. So there could be some very different regions there that are distinct from Germany. So now if you look to the other half of the picture, you can see a set of sending countries that start out earning less than the US born. And this would be the rags to riches candidates. I mean, you can't move from rags to riches if you never came in rags, but these are possible candidates for, very rapid movement. And we do see upward mobility for immigrants that's a bit faster than upward mobility for the US born over the age earnings profile. So as you get older, everyone's earning more, but it looks like immigrants are doing so a bit faster, but not nearly to the point where there's catch up, let alone overtaking or surpassing, which is what the academic literature had argued before we were able to come and follow people over time. And that's the natural way to answer this question. It's really a question about how you're doing as you move through your career. And with the proper data in hand, we're able to see that actually immigrants that started out behind the US born are moving up a little bit, but not nearly overtaking and roughly at the same pace as immigrants today. So, of course, if you're thinking about the first generation only and you're worried that immigrants are going to stagnate, indeed, we see that upward mobility for the first generation is pretty slow, both in the past and today. So that's where we really need to turn to the second generation and ask about persistence. So our
I
immigrant
just want to,
families.
before we move, I want to pause on a joke by
Yep.
Brett DeLong. He said the difference between Austria and Germany is due to Nikolaus Tesla. But this was just a humor comment.
Yes.
Because he came from the Austrian-Hungary Empire initially.
Yes. Yes, and there were a number of, skilled engineers and technicians who were coming from Germany, Austria, from the UK, bringing in a lot of new ideas to the US. And so I think people tend to forget about the ways in which immigrants from those countries actually were arriving from places that had better developed systems of higher education than the US. We used to send people to Germany to do their chemistry degrees before World War I. So, now turning to the third myth, which is that immigrant families would become stuck in a permanent underclass. So I'm just going to highlight on this slide data for the current period, though we have similar such data for the past as well. And what I'm going to start with here is a comparison between first generation immigrants who are in the black circles, and then their children, second generation immigrants who are in the red diamonds, where the zero line is again going to be the US born. And so today you can see that there's a series of sending countries that have very low earnings relative to the US born when we're talking about the parent generation. This is data for parents who would be in the labor market in 1980. And we're doing this so that we have enough time to be able to take a look at the children of those parents who would be in the labor market today. To start with, we're just going to look at average families. This picture does not connect a parent to his or her own child, but instead is looking at averages by country of origin. So you can see that the average earnings for immigrants from Vietnam, Dominican Republic, Mexico, Haiti, El Salvador, et cetera, were very low relative to the US born. And I think that's what gave rise to some of the concerns. If this pattern replicates into the next generation, then we're really going to be in the realm of a permanent underclass. But take a look at workers today who report that their parents came from one of these sending countries. For the most part, the children have reached the zero line, even if their parents were substantially below zero when their parents were in the labor market. There are a couple of sending countries where that's not true: Mexico, Haiti, and Jamaica. We'll have more to say about Haiti and Jamaica as we start talking on the next few slides. But even in those cases, we see that the children have made up a substantial amount of ground. Now, what we see here is that if you're the child of immigrants, because immigrant parents tend to be below the zero line, you're on average going to be raised in a poorer household. So what we wanted to do was to be able to compare apples to apples. And so we're going to say, what happens to children of immigrants or children of the US born who are being raised at the same point in the income distribution? And we can do this for every percentile, but I'll focus today on the 25th percentile, which gives us a good window into what's going on for children who are being raised by the working poor. So to be at the 25th percentile today, it would be like two working parents, both earn minimum wage and both work full time. That would place you at the 25th percentile. So in this case, we do need to have parents linked to children because we need to know for someone who we see in the labor market, what was their parental income income percentile during their own childhood. And so the data we have for the modern period comes from the Opportunity Atlas. This is the group at Harvard that's run by Raj Chetty that has the underlying income tax data. And we have children linked up to their parents because they show up as a tax dependent when they're in childhood, and then through Social Security numbers can be linked to their own modern earnings. And I'll talk about this slide extensively in a second, but just to show you, we also have similar pictures for the historical data. And in that case, we have the census records where you see, for example, like my grandfather living at home with his father, that would be the childhood period. And then we can follow that person forward to the labor market. And so what we see is for people who are raised in households at the 25th percentile of the income distribution, the group that is reaching nearly the lowest percentile today in their own adulthood labor market are children of US born parents, here with this magenta dot. And almost all of the children of immigrants for all of these sending countries are achieving a higher level of income when they themselves reach adulthood. And of course, that makes sense given that we see that immigrant kids would have been raised in these poorer households, and yet they're mostly reaching the zero line when they themselves get to adulthood. So there's a number of incredibly interesting patterns if you start to stare at the details. For example, you can point to Nigeria here, which is, I think Brad was asking about. So the children of parents from Nigeria who are raised at the 25th percentile are reaching like the 52nd percentile, whereas the children of US born are only reaching like the 46th. And that's true also of Dominican Republic. So these are two majority Black sending countries, and yet even though we're comparing only to the children of white US born parents, the children of these of immigrants from these sending countries are doing substantially better. It's not true though of boys, and I really emphasize boys from these three majority Black Caribbean countries: Haiti, Trinidad and Tobago, and Jamaica. And what's really interesting is if we look at daughters, in fact, the daughters of families from these three Caribbean countries are right up in the middle. So it's something particular to do not only with race, because it doesn't show up with the Nigerian or Dominican Republic case, and not only with being Caribbean, because it doesn't show up with the daughters. It's something that's an interaction between Caribbean and gender. Of course, you can also see some really interesting patterns with Asian families. Asian families who are raising their kids at the 25th percentile have kids who reach up between the 60th and 65th percentile. So really just tremendous amount of upward mobility.
So there's a question by Karen Lin. She really would like to know why the Indians and Chinese do so much better than, let's say, Pakistani or Vietnamese. There's a huge jump essentially.
There's there's definitely a big jump. I mean, to me, what's really striking is 60 to 65 relative to 45. So I really like to zoom out and kind of group the Asian countries here as sort of being at the top, and then kind of sort of go down the list. But I do take your point that 60 and 65 are not the same, and there's something interesting going on here. We do have some speculation in the book about what's going on. These are families where the parents are earning at the 25th percentile for a sustained period of time. It's not like you get one little data point on the parents and they happen to be graduate students who are getting a stipend, but then they really move up the ladder. The parents on average, we have around 7 years of income data for them, and we're still placing them at the 25th percentile. There are a number of families, even from Hong Kong, China, and India, where the parents are hotel workers, restaurant workers, and working in laundry, working in hospitals, kind of as orderlies and that sort of thing. So there is a large, low lower paid service sector for those countries. And there has been some speculation that because the remainder of the country of origin group in the US is on average earning more, on average has higher education levels, that parents are able to tap into an ethnic network to help their kids get ahead. So even if they themselves aren't earning very much, there are other people who are going to church with them for a Chinese church, who are going to cultural centers, in the case of Indian or Pakistani, going to mosque, and they're able to interact through ethnic networks. This
And
is
are you
fascinating, and we don't have strong evidence to say about each particular case, and hopefully
Mhm.
this is going to open up more food for thought.
So when you take the percentiles, do you take it as at the national level or at the regional level? Because it could be that certain immigrants concentrate in New York City, but you earn pretty well in New York City, but relative to your neighbors, you're still pretty poor. If you're in some other place, more in the countryside, then, with the same amount of dollars, you're much more wealthy.
So hold that thought, Marcus, because it's really going to be the next slide. Geography
Oh,
is
okay.
incredibly important. Before I get to that, and that's a great question, let me just show you that the very same type of pattern happens for immigrants from the Ellis Island period. Let's just focus on the 1910 kids who are at home with their parents. This would be like my grandfather. Again, the US born parents who are raising their kids at the 25th percentile have kids who move up almost the least, and a whole set of children of immigrants are doing better. Particularly, and this is quite notable, Italians, Irish, and Portuguese, which are groups that were pointed to by politicians at the time, saying, oh, they're never going to assimilate, they're never going to move up the ladder. And so trying to get at why this is going on, we have only really speculation about the country differences, but we have some really interesting, hard data on why the children of immigrants overall are doing better than the children of US born. And geography is an incredibly important part of the story. So again, just focusing on the 1910 cohort because the pattern is quite similar in both. What I'm showing you here on the left-hand side of the picture is the average difference between children of immigrants and children of US born, not controlling for anything. So basically it's like take this pattern here where you have 40 versus 45, and that's why we end up with a 5 or 6 rank point difference on average. Then just control for, do you live in the US South? Immigrants avoided the South in 1910, which was a very agricultural region, heavily invested in cotton growing, and not a place with high upward mobility for anyone, either Black, which I think people are quite aware, but also white families. And so since immigrants avoided the South to move to the North and the West, that's a portion of why their children were able to do better. Avoid the red hotspot on the famous Chetty maps about a location with low upward mobility. And then if you move all the way over to the right-hand side of this picture, you can see that when you include county fixed effects, so you're comparing an immigrant family and a US born family basically down the road, you actually find no advantage in particular to the children of immigrants. And what that teaches us is that this large advantage is coming from geographic location choices, and that in the past, what this meant was avoiding the South and moving to cities rather than moving to farms. Today, what this means is children of immigrants more likely to be growing up in these coastal cities, where I take Marcus's point, maybe your dollars don't go as far, but you also have a wide range of opportunities for jobs in finance and tech and education and health. And those are opportunities that the children of immigrants can tap into more than the children of the US born.
Brett DeLong would like to ask you, is it the case that there's an upward movement not only on the income ladder, but also the occupation ladder? Do you see that the kids are in the same profession as the parents, or do you see a lot of movement across professions for immigrants?
You see a lot of movement across professions. So we also broke things down into transition matrices. So you see that the children of unskilled laborers who have immigrant parents are more likely to move up into skilled blue collar or into white collar, for example. So a lot of what we're picking up actually in the historical data does come from occupational moves, given that we do not have income data until 1940. And in the 1910 to 40 cohort, we can look at both. We can look at income or we can look only at occupation-based income, and we find very similar patterns, which suggest that a lot of it is coming from occupational moves.
And another question by Josh here, he would like to know, it could be that the first generation is held back by a lack of language skills, while the second generation doesn't have this issue. Is there a way to control, did you control for that it's, the fact that you know English much better is actually a big advantage for the second generation, and that's why they're moving up.
That is exactly right. So one thing that we have done to try to get at that is to break apart this rank gap for all children of immigrants into children of immigrants where the immigrant arrived before age 12, so that they have a chance of being fully fluent in English, or arrived in teenagerhood, so that maybe they could go to school a bit in the US, or arrived as adults, 17 or older. And actually, the vast majority of this mobility gain for the children of immigrants is coming from children of immigrants who arrived as adults. And so that gives you a sense that the adult was sort of held back by his lack of English skills or his lack of labor market network. But it's not just that he moved from abroad. And so that also starts to get at some of the selection issues, because there's really not a strong reason why someone who moved at 13 or 14 would necessarily be differently selected than someone who moved at 17 or 18. One thing that you all were very strong on is the idea that immigrant success does not come at the expense of the US born. So I guess I'm speaking to primarily an audience of economists now, and I think that that's something that's a relatively widely shared opinion among economists. But when I talk to people in a whole variety of other settings, I don't think that this view is widely shared by all. There's much more division about the idea. So I'll just touch on this a little bit, even though I don't think that this audience particularly comes in with that particular view. I think we've all heard from supporters of border restriction who argue that immigrants steal jobs and reduce wages for the US born. And this argument is very easy to understand, and it sounds reasonable that if there really were a fixed number of jobs, then each immigrant who comes in and is employed necessarily would have to take away a job from someone else if there really is a zero-sum nature to the economy. But there's a number of reasons why this might not be true. Immigrants are workers, surely, but they're also consumers. And so when they arrive in the US, they need someplace to live. Someone needs to construct the house for them. Their kids need to go to school. Someone has to become a teacher. So they also increase labor demand. We know that immigrants also are disproportionately likely to patent, contribute to innovation, start businesses. So they also create jobs for others. And even though there really are some winners and some losers to immigration, the losers are people who do very similar jobs to what immigrants do. And that tends to be other recent immigrants, actually, not even US born who are low skilled, given that there's specialization in tasks that require English skill or that are more manual jobs. And so these are arguments that I think we've all heard as economists. And I just want to emphasize that looking back into the past will help us solidify or question some of these arguments. Because really, in order to learn about what happens when immigrants come in or don't come in, we'd like to be able to compare two Americas, one with a high level of immigration and one with a low level of immigration, and see what happens as we run those parallel countries forward. But of course, we can only run history once. And so we do have the advantage of being able to look back in time at periods where through the normal political process, we actually did run this experiment a couple of times. And one was the 1920s border closure. So we do talk about this in the book. And basically the idea is, to compare cities or farming regions that are very similar. And what's different about them is how many Southern and Eastern Europeans did they have? So their population size is very similar. Even their foreign-born share is similar. But if you have a lot of Southern and Eastern Europeans, you're more influenced by the border closure that was targeted against those groups. So you can see even in Ohio, for example, like the Cleveland and Toledo area versus Cincinnati have different exposure to this particular policy. And what we find is that if you have more exposure, you'd be a city over here, and less exposure, you'd be a city over here. No difference in the earnings of local residents who were living in those cities as of 1920. after the border closes, looking from 20 to 30. So just a big flat line. And so what did happen, there was a number of other ways that firms can adjust. When they lose one source of labor, they would turn to other sources and not necessarily to the locals who were already in that labor market. So many US born workers moved into those cities from other parts of the country. And also, there was a set of immigrants who were not restricted. The quota only impacted Europe and Asia and not the Western Hemisphere. So Canadian and Mexican migration picked up in that period. And then if you're looking at farms, farmers also were heavy users of immigrant farm labor, and they replaced this labor with machinery. So what we want to say here is not that we think the economy is necessarily going to adapt in exactly the same way in 2020 as in 1920, but just to say that the lesson of the fact that there's many ways for firms to adjust and to substitute. When they lose immigrant labor, they might turn to outsourcing, they might turn to automation, and they're not necessarily going to turn to the worker next door. Let me close with a few thoughts of where we
Can
can
I
go
ask you
from
one more
here.
question about,
Yeah.
did you study also that the immigrants are typically younger compared to the average population in the US, in a sense that, it helps, of course, the demographics and, otherwise the population would get older and older, and that hurts innovation and many other aspects of the economy. How important is that component in your thinking?
Well, this is one of the reasons why we're concerned about the idea of turning to only high-skilled immigration. Many people say to us, okay, so you've convinced me that immigrants are, they're not that bad for the economy. Their kids tend to do pretty well. But, given that we can pick and choose of anyone around the world, why would we not pick just all the PhDs? And, then we can really load up on a lot of Steve Jobs, and that would be the best outcome. But given that the country is aging and we're going to need a lot of lower skilled workers who can work with the elderly, for example, it's not obvious that that's the distribution of immigrant skills that we need. And so if we're going to be relying on immigrant workers to, for example, take care of the elderly, then we do worry, what if the children and the grandchildren of those immigrants kind of remain only low skilled jobs are open to them. And so, that's why we say here that in terms of what some of the lessons might be for policy, we think that our results point really strongly to the fact that we do not need to pre-select immigrants based on their wealth or education level, as in the Canadian point system, and as was just proposed by the Trump administration in 2017, both combining a cut of the number of legal slots with a shift towards really emphasizing only the educated. And we think that, in the short run, sure, that might, it could be that PhDs contribute more to growth in the short run. But we think that if we take a longer view and we're thinking at the level of generations rather than at just the level of the immediate need, there's a number of elements in the labor market that has strong demand for immigrants. So agriculture in terms of actually hand picking crops, as we talked about, elderly, childcare, and construction, restaurant work, landscaping. So there's a number of things where we have strong demand, but those workers tend to be lower skilled, and that does raise concerns for people. But I think the lessons from this book is that we don't need to be concerned. We can have confidence that the American economy is strong enough that it can allow the children of these immigrants to rise in the second generation.
But the argument that, on the other hand, the wage level of the lower skilled workers will be depressed, and you widen the skill gap. Do you hear this argument often as well? So if we let the more lower skilled people in and we don't let the high skilled people in, so in a sense we create more competition in the low skilled labor market, and then we widen the skill gap in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, we do have a pretty balanced path right now with many low skilled, but also many high skilled immigrants. And so we certainly aren't saying that we should tilt everything only to the low skilled. But right now we have, as we talked about, the sort of bimodal skill distribution. And those are sets of skills that are in relatively short supply in the US. While we have a number of high school grads, we don't have a lot of people who only went through 8th or 9th grade. We also have a number of college grads, but we don't have a lot of PhDs and people who've gone beyond BA. Those are two elements where the demand is being met by workers from abroad. And it's sort of spreading out any potential competition effects of immigration across the board. But we do point to a number of these arguments, both conceptual arguments about, well, if the alternative is outsourcing, then the work is going to be done abroad, and that implicitly is going to be increasing the number of effective workers who are working in the US economy, but won't be increasing the consumer base. So having a lot of local demand for immigrants actually living in our communities and therefore demanding local services is an important factor in terms of increasing demand that would then offer jobs to others. And also this argument here about how there's a lot of subspecialization, and in fact, it tends to be that recent immigrants are the ones who face most of the direct competition when new immigrants come in. So there's a lot of occupational segregation. And then, we did mention this particular case of the 1920s and how there's not much gain that comes from restricting the border to the very local people who were experiencing the largest reductions in immigration. The same kind of argument or evidence has been found throughout the century. So I just highlighted the 1920s, but people have looked also in the 1960s with the ending of a farm labor program called the Bracero program that was intentional. The closure of that program was intended to allow jobs to open up in agriculture for US born. And turns out that it actually just encouraged mechanization in farming and similar kinds of events like this. So it seems to be a very consistent pattern when you turn to the empirical evidence. So while there are theoretical arguments that could go either way, the data seems to come down on the side that leads us not to be as concerned about the potential blowback on the US born.
But in general, if you want to restrict, you would say there's a random cutoff. Essentially, we want to let X number of people in, and we don't select at all. We just say, okay, this the first come, first serve, essentially, and then we say it's closed now for this year, and then we open up next year again, rather than going for a more selective point system.
So I think that there's some tinkering we can do. First of all, on the current number of immigrants, we currently let in 675,000, but then we have an unrestricted category of direct family members. So a spouse of a US citizen, for example, can come in without a cap. So we end up with around 1 million entrants a year. And it's not so obvious that 1 million is the right number. There have been some work by think tanks that have said maybe it should go up by around 200,000. So it should be 1,200,000 just to kind of keep pace with demographic change and the aging of the workforce. So notice that that's not like going all the way to open borders or anything like that. You can tinker with the number and especially maybe increase it a bit without bringing on all of the kind of doom and gloom that you might hear. And also when it comes to selection, it's not so obvious that the current selection patterns is exactly the right one. Right now, we don't have a point system, but we do have a very strong family reunification based immigration system. Now, some people are worried that that means we're going to bring in a number of dependents who are simply here as family members and not here as productive workers. And that tends not to be the case. Many people arrive first as students and then they find work, they get a green card and so on. And so when they send for family members, those family members have a lot of the same attributes, like they also have skill and education. So we shouldn't think so starkly as family immigrants are just dependents and employment-based immigrants are hard workers. But it's not so clear that we have the right mix. We certainly had experimented with increasing the H-1B visa cap, for example. Now that's temporary residents, but often temporary residents that convert into employer-sponsored immigrants with a green card. And it's not at all clear why the cap that has been in place since the 90s and increased only temporarily for a few years before coming back down is really the right cap for 2022. So I'm not trying to say that we shouldn't tinker, but I'm definitely trying to say we should not throw out the current system in favor of one that really only is giving points for having a BA or knowing English or that sort of thing, uh, as is the case in Canada. Our system is actually working quite well. We can essentially allow the market to tell us which skills we need. Immigrants will come in response to those price signals. In the first generation, if they're a lower skilled person who has a high school education or less, they won't earn very much, and that's why we saw those large gaps in the first generation, but the children will do well.
So let me ask finally 2 questions, if you don't mind. One is, did you look at the mobility, the physical regional mobility of second generation? So are people who are immigrants or kids of immigrants, are they more willing to move across the country? There's more mobility moving from one city to another city. And the other question I have is that, did you look in particular at refugees? So if we have people who had to flee because of some war in their home country and they came to the US, do they behave, is it different, or are different patterns, or the same as any other immigrant?
Great questions. Let me start with the refugee one, because that is something that we have worked on very recently, continue to work on, and it's also in the book. In the modern data, people have found in the US that refugees actually assimilate faster than economic migrants, learn English more quickly, end up moving up the occupational ladder, higher earnings more quickly than economic migrants. That's true for the US, and it's interestingly not true for European countries. So it's not only something having to do with refugees, but it's something about refugees in the United States. No one had looked at refugees for the past. And while our official refugee system was established in 1980, there surely were immigrants who were fleeing persecution in the past. So we looked at this question for the first time. And in order to do that, you need to know who's a refugee and who's not. It's not easy, but we do have a set of around 1,200 oral histories that the Ellis Island Foundation collected. When these immigrants were late in life, they were 75 or 80, and they were reflecting back on the whole pattern of why they left Europe, how well they did when they first arrived in the US, and then where their life ended up. And it turns out,
if you think about the Nazi people, the Jews fleeing from the Nazis, I guess probably one could identify by last names or something like that.
exactly. But what we really wanted to do was to be able to look at within a religious community and within a country of origin, so that we weren't just going to be comparing Jews to non-Jews, but we wanted to say within the Jewish population, going all the way back to 1900 or so, there were periodic pogroms and people left for persecution reasons. But then there were also plenty of people, like my family, was just leaving because they were poor, just like anyone else, leaving from other parts of Europe. So we wanted to compare refugees to non-refugees within a country of origin. What we found was that refugees do learn English more effectively by the end of life, very similar to what people found for today. And refugees do earn more sort of at mid-career, similar to what people find for the US today. So that all makes sense from an economic framework, in the sense that if you think you might move back, which around 25-30% of economic migrants did do, then you're kind of hedging your bets. You're not necessarily investing in as many US-based skills like learning English. If you know that even if you have nostalgia for your home country, you really can't go back there because you face persecution when you go back, then you're really going to dive in and invest in skills. So then the question becomes, what's going on with refugees in Europe? Why don't they really fit that economic model? What is going on about in the process of integration there? And ironically, European countries actually offer more integration services, more language classes, more supports, but the refugees there aren't doing as well. So there's something very special about US ability to integrate immigrants. And also, I think probably will find as the research develops, it's also true in Canada, it's also true in Australia. So it's something about the long-standing immigrant receiving countries. The other question about second generation moving more readily, um, actually, we haven't looked at that, and no one has really looked at that for the children of immigrants. But for immigrants themselves, yes, immigrants themselves do move very readily when there's an economic downturn in their local area. There's good work that's done by Brian Cadena and Brian Kovac about the Great Recession period. And in a way, immigrants become insurance for locals. So locals, US born, don't want to necessarily leave. They have a lot of family connections, but when times are really tough, they may feel forced to leave. And immigrants are the ones who leave first. And so they may help equilibrate the labor markets and make it possible for the US born to stay.
I see. Thanks a lot. It was fascinating, and we learned a lot about this. Particularly, I do because I'm not an expert in this area, and I can only recommend everybody to buy the book and read it and get even more details about all these various studies, which are all nicely summarized in the book.
I just wanted to flash a copy of Streets of Gold on the screen. I think one of the best parts of the book is the cover, which is beautiful and has this optimistic, hopeful image. So it is intended to bring in all the research and digest it, but also to be readable and almost like a beach read. So I recommend it for the summer.
Great. So everybody who goes to the beach, they should buy the book and read it. And even if you don't go to the beach, you should read it too. And thanks a lot, Leah. And next week, we will have Oleg Itskotsky. He will talk about sanctions and exchange rates. We're looking forward to seeing you again. And thanks a lot for all the questions and for being part of it. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.